The Lean Startup, a methodology for developing products and businesses using short cycles of build, measure, learn to continuously improve. That's probably the crispiest definition one can provide, but what impact does this have on products, on businesses, and more so on the culture of an organization? A startup may embrace this methodology on day one of its conception and not even realize how its culture gets molded by it. However, more mature organizations who wish to realize the benefits of this methodology do witness a cultural change, sometimes not very successful ones. So it only seemed fair to speak with someone like Bob van Luijt, the CEO and co-founder of Semantic Technologies, who's witnessed this multiple times. His current startup provides a solution called Weaviate, which is a semantic search engine with built-in machine learning to search through unstructured data. And this is used by huge organizations for building, for example, their knowledge graphs. It was fascinating for me to understand from him how one can balance out cultural differences when working in a space like his. And hopefully, you find this just as interesting as I did. I am your host, Vishal Prasad, and this is EnterpriseJoy, educating organizations to be awesome. Welcome, Bob. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are discussing the Lean Startup. Lean Startup popularized by Eric Ries, but in a slightly different context. So for most people, the idea of a Lean Startup is very synonymous with building products, which isn't completely wrong. However, what we are going to focus on today is how that affects the culture of an organization, which may or may not be a startup. So without further ado, let me ask you, Bob, you have had a couple of startups of your own and a number of initiatives as well. So what role has the fundamentals of Lean Startup played for you and your initiatives?
Yeah, so I think that if we look at the Lean Startup methodology itself, right, it's a methodology. And as I see it, what the problem that it tries to solve is actually that with the rise of software and the role of software in businesses, the way we do business or we build new businesses or even products has changed. And for me, the Lean Startup methodology had the goal to try to marry those two things together. So something is changing in the world. That's basically how we build businesses and products through software. And that changes how we work. And that has, of course, also a direct impact on the culture that we work in and how we work together. So I think that the most important thing there is that the culture is changing, not necessarily because of the Lean Startup methodology, but the underlying thing why the methodology is created, and that is the way that we build products today using software changes how we build our businesses and our cultures.
Right. Yeah, and what many may not know is that the Lean Startup by Eric Ries especially was not the first that explained the lean strategies for success, right? So back in 2005, these ideas were pretty much also prevalent in the words of Steve Blank, which also he explains in his book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. However, in 2005, this did not see like a grand explosion of acceptance like how we saw in 2011 with the Lean Startup. And one of the reasons I believe this happened was because of the diffusion of innovation. So I can think of 2005 as an era of early adopters, considering people like Steve Blank were the innovators. And we are possibly now in an era of early majority. So what, according to you, has been the biggest enablers to make this shift happen from 2011 to 2020 now, where we are seeing a lot of people who are embracing the aspect of Lean Startup?
Yeah, so to answer that question, I would like to go back even one step further back in time. And that's basically when the Agile Manifesto was created. So basically the generation before me, because I was too young when I was working with software when the Agile Manifesto was written, but I was very young back then. I mean, people learned that software became extremely important the ways that people were building products and solutions was not working for software. So we got to all the Agile Manifesto and Agile Working. What has changed? Well, I think that the generation of people that now are growing into, especially if you look at enterprises, into leadership roles, they grew up with the internet. So they have a more natural understanding of how technology works and how it influences how we do business. So the reason that it's happening right now, I believe, is that it's more intuitive for people how the software functions. So the theory maps on more easily on how they operate. And I think the biggest shift that we're seeing, how especially enterprises structure themselves.
But just to be clear, this doesn't apply only to startups, right? This is pretty much an idea or a way of working that's been proven successful for many. And in fact, a lot of the big and mature organizations, they realize that this is important for their survival. And that's where the aspect of cultural shift becomes very important, comes into the picture. If I may ask like a two-part question to you. Have you seen Semi's organization culture being molded by lean startups? So that will be the first question. Have you seen it mold your own culture for your organization? And second would be, how have you seen it changing for your customers' organization when it came to lean startup or the lean way of working?
Yes. So for the first question, I think that again, so I'm one of the co-founders of a startup, and so we're not an enterprise yet. That's what we're trying to become, or a large organization. And so what you see where we are now in our journey, if you look back and you look at the methodology and the textbook until going from a scale up to becoming from a startup becoming scale up, it maps on quite well. Not everything, but it maps on quite well, and you learn a lot of additional things. So that's the answer to your first question. The second question that's a more difficult one to answer because our customers are enterprises. And before this company, I also had another business which was more consultancy focused and also in software, but also with enterprise customers. And you absolutely see that these organizations try to adopt this because they know that there's a change, there's a shift happening. It's often it's all beautifully explained in disruption theory. So just imagine that if you're a business leader who started his or her career in the 70s or the 80s, you did not have to worry about this small player coming up from below. What disruption theory learns us.
Right.
That is something that has completely changed. So let's say that you're a bank, like a huge bank. There was just not really a need to be afraid of what's now called challenger banks. But the reason that these challenger banks can do this is because of the technology and the software that they have. That's what's making the change. That's also what disruption theory says. It says like, okay, you must have a technology driver. If you don't have a technology driver, disruption theory is not going to work. So having that said, now you have this big organization with this big culture, which is based on this thinking from the 70s and the 80s. In a specific hierarchy, and the hierarchy also says like we're gonna focus on our core competence and what we can do, and we outsource the rest. And now this completely new method comes in and says like no, you have to do this completely different. You literally have to reverse that model. That is extremely difficult culturally for a wide variety of reasons. Of which is that these people are not they're not used to this way of technology thinking, and now on top of that, these young people come in and say, "Nah, you're doing it all wrong. We need to reverse the whole model, and we're gonna build everything ourselves." It's very scary to be in a leadership position if you're in your 50s right now.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what makes them stiff. But one more thing to add there is maybe also the responsibility of us being the younger generation to help them, to explain to them how it works and to show them the results in action, and not necessarily have assume that they will change out of themselves, or we need to help them. So it's something that you do together, and that's a way how you can take that stiffness away, I think.
Absolutely. Let's dive into a few aspects as well of the lean startup philosophy, which kind of revolves around this same topic. So we do understand that the build, measure, learn cycle, this is like one of the most important things that we address with lean startup. And especially the term when we call MVPs, or minimum viable products.
Mm-hmm.
And although I have seen this term being used and misused almost on a daily basis, the idea of MVP itself seems so misunderstood that a great extent of people equate that with their first release. So let's do one thing. Let's try and understand what an MVP is and how that creates a different kind of a mindset for building products. So Bob, you yourself, when you have built products, if you can give some example of how you have equated MVPs with something that you have done in the past.
How I see it, the MVP is that it starts as a project. The idea is that the project that you're working on, notice how I'm not calling it a product yet, but a project, generates value for somebody. And what do we mean with value is that somebody rewards you for what you're doing. And there can be a reward in many ways. It can be very small. That can be somebody writing a positive blog post, or that can be big in the sense that people pay you money. For me, that cycle of the MVP is the first time that you got to a point where the user of what you're creating has everything to solve their problem. That's the first iteration. And then out of that, they find new things. Can you do this as well? Oh, or this, I would like to do this or that, or what have you. And then you start a new cycle. And that's how the cycle keeps going around. So that's how I see that cycle. And you, how do you see it?
Yeah, so for me, I don't think MVP is like a one-time thing, right? It is repetitive, as you said. It's a number of cycles which continuously keep on getting built. And the way I look at each of the cycle is it's like an experiment. So it's based on some hypothesis, and the hypothesis goes out to the consumers use it, and that comes in as a feedback. Again, the feedback, as you said, can be monetary, can be a blog, can be some kind of an appreciation. But the feedback is ultimately an acceptance. And if that acceptance happens well, then I can build on to that hypothesis, and I can keep on growing it and keep on making it bigger and bigger. And in fact, it may not even be as straightforward as just one loop between one party as it may seem on paper. So for example, so when the two of us, we started working like a year back on one of the engagements, right, with our client. But if I look at the kind of relationship that the two of us had, so you had a product Weaviate, which is pretty much a knowledge graph, and you were creating the product features that could be consumed by my team, and my team was running experiments in order to benefit the client's product. Yes. So we kind of were in a complex loop where you were creating MVPs for my team, and I was creating MVP based on that MVP for the consumer. And this cycle was continuing in a much bigger feedback loop than just saying, hey, this is one circle that says you have to build, measure, and then continue doing this. So I think the entire aspect of MVP, as you said, it's not very straightforward. It's not just to say that this is what MVP is all about. But what's important is to build these things in smaller pieces, get it validated, and get feedback in some manner that says, yes, what we have received is value at the end.
Yes, but I do think that it's fragmented, right? So software is not one thing that we do, right? It's always a stack. So let's say that you would assign a software engineer or a designer to create the EnterpriseJoy .com website from top down to the stack. So you have you as the end customer, and you are working with a front end developer that needs to satisfy your minimal viable needs for the EnterpriseJoy podcast. But if you go down the stack, maybe this front-end developer needs a back-end developer that helps him or her to set up let's say that you run it on WordPress, that they need to set up WordPress, right? Yeah. So there, the person, the user that needs to be satisfied in his minimal viable setup is not you, but that is the front-end engineer that you hire. If you go further down the stack, then it runs, let's say that it runs at the cloud provider, at Google Cloud, then it runs on an Apache web server. So now the community of Apache maintaining the Apache web server has a user, which is
the
backend developer who is working for the front-end developer who is working for you. That needs to be satisfied in a minimal time. And we can go all the way down until we are at Intel making chips that are part of the engines that are running the EnterpriseJoy.com website. So my point is, there are many of these cycles at work here. And one of the things that somebody who is mentoring me also in the sales part of what I'm doing with my business and with Weaviate is that if you build software which sits in the middle of that stack that I just said, so which we are, the end result, how people use Weaviate always is something that's built on top of it. You could call them partners. So we like to refer to them as our partners that we work with, because we partner up together to deliver something to a customer at the end down the line. We need to satisfy the partners. We need to listen to what the partners are saying. So in this case, this was your team giving us feedback on things that they were missing or that they wanted to do different. And that's how we learn. And so there are many of these MVP cycles going simultaneously and if they all resonate together, then we have an end product that an end user can use.
Okay, so since we are there, do you have a favorite MVP story from the industry?
Sometimes certain ideas that sound so simple, not in, and I don't mean it as simplistic, but simple as in minimal. That's better words. So minimalistic, and so something that comes to mind is, for example, Android. Just the idea of we get operating systems for mobile phones. Why not take a Linux kernel and build a operating system on top of that for mobile phones? I think that's a beautiful example of something that is a viable product. So I'm not talking about the minimal part yet, but about a viable product which it sounds so simple if you think about it and see how much value that it's creating for the world. It does not necessarily say something about a minimal viable story, but it's an example of something that is so big, so complex, but on the other hand also so minimalistic.
So the way I see is when we say MVP, it's not necessarily always like a software or like an end product that ultimately comes out of it. There are so many different ways of just representing MVP. It's like even in the Android case, just the idea seems very simple, and that has produced a lot of value. And I think similar things happened with Dropbox as well, right? So when Dropbox was struggling with the initial level of investments just to get their product rolling, I think they made it through just with the help of a video. So one of my other favorites is when we come to LinkedIn. So LinkedIn now has this show that I'm open for work that gets featured just for recruiters. And I haven't validated the story, but the way the story goes is initially when LinkedIn came up with this feature, the feature didn't do anything. All it did was it collected data as to how many people are open for this kind of a feature to be injected into LinkedIn. And only when they saw substantial interest by the number of people who were clicking on this one small little option button that says, yes, I'm open to let recruiters know that I am open for new jobs. That's when they invested in building that feature. And that's, again, one of the ways of thinking differently as to, in the older times, I would have wanted, let's say, a business analyst writing a business case with some alternatives and going to budgeting and saying, hey, I need money for building something. All that changes now, because now the cultural shift is, why don't we give out something to the users first, get their feedback and see how they are interested in using something, whether it's a product or a business service or anything. And if we see substantial interest, then we go ahead and simply build it. And that's good enough a business case to get an investment instead of spending a lot of upfront time just analyzing a situation. And that's where I see a shift just because of the idea of an MVP.
Yeah, so if you say it like that, then I understand your question. I now understand it differently as which is a beautiful answer, by the way, which has to do with the validation part, right? So that you how do you validate that the idea that you have is that it's a good idea? That's the question. So which can start from a blog post, right? So you have an idea for something, you write a blog post, and you go like, who would be interested in doing this, or thinking about doing that, and those kind of things. And if a lot of people like it or give you feedback and say like, oh, that would be so awesome if it would be there, then you can go into the next cycle and you can build a mock-up and those kind of things. So then you keep the cycles very short, but you constantly are looking for that validation.
User experience now has become a big thing, right? And for good reasons, that we want to provide good experience to our users. But one place where I've seen a number of teams failing is when you have user experience designers who would spend a lot of time in just understanding the entire big picture of, understanding the big picture is not a bad thing, but really designing the end-to-end big picture upfront just in order to build an ultimate product. But it's not about building the ultimate product. That's where MVP is different. It's about building these smaller chunks and getting this validated, and even changing the way you ask your questions. Actually, there's one question which gives you your data when you ask, hey, tell me what's your problem? And that's a fair question. But the moment you ask the second question of how do we solve it, that's where Conway's law kicks in. Because when you ask a user of how to solve it, they will tell you the answer in the way their current communication structure is set up. If you want to change that aspect of getting the entire business shift happen, you have to think beyond how your Conway's communication structure is set up. And that's a good way of building your MVPs, as to trying these small experiments with some hypothesis. Just go and try it out. Even if you fail, that's fine. It's a small investment. But you need to try something different in order to be innovative in your entire business.
If it's okay with you, I would like to address the question, but from a different angle. That's what I think is not happening enough. And I'm absolutely guilty of this as well. And I'm training myself to become better at it. Is we don't listen well to what people are saying. I once heard somebody say something which was about that. There's this quote that apparently was once said by Henry Ford. Funny thing is that it seems to be never proven that he actually said it, but that's another story. That he said, if I would have asked people if they wanted a car, they would have said, what they wanted. They would have said, I want to have a faster horse. They wouldn't have said a car. The thing is, I heard an alternative analysis of this quote. It has nothing to do with that people want cars. It has nothing to do with horses, because if you listen very well to what people say, what's in that quote, it's very simple. People want faster. The keyword is not the horse. The keyword is the word fast. So now you can say as a business, dear sir, madam, I'm sorry, I cannot breed you a faster horse, but I can build you this machine on 4 wheels, which will bring you from A to B faster. So this is a long story to make my point that not necessarily in saying like, we see, for example, Conway's law at work or culture in the organization is by definition, for example, stiff. So therefore it's difficult to move to. No. I think we as people creating products and solutions, in this case in software, it's our duty to listen better to what people are telling us.
You know what? I'm just going to go one step further and say, the cultural difference that we want to bring in is have people listen better. And that probably will solve a lot of problems that we have.
Yes. And I love that where we are right now, because that means, so now we're getting to something interesting about culture, is that's why it's so important that you have a diverse and opening culture. Because if people are afraid in the culture where they're in, even if they're a tiny bit afraid, they will not tell you what they're thinking. And if they're not able to share what they're thinking, we cannot understand what it is that they need and what they want.
Let's be leaner.
Yes. Try to listen better.
Bob, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. This was really amazing speaking with you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Yeah.
Take care, Bob.
Bye-bye.
See you. That was Bob discussing a culture called the Lean Startup. I will leave a link to his profile and references from today's episode in the show description. If you found this discussion just as educational as I did, then do subscribe to EnterpriseJoy wherever you listen to podcasts. A shout out to our patrons Sebastian Holscher and David Taborek for supporting this podcast. And if you would like to support this podcast as well, then become a patron on patreon.com/EnterpriseJoy. Patrons receive some exclusive benefits like access to an early release of the 1-hour uncut ad-free version of this episode with Bob. So do check out what we have to offer. The details of the upcoming episodes can be found on enterprisejoy.com, and you can send your feedback and comments to vishal@enterprisejoy.com so our podcast can continuously improve. Until next time, thank you for listening, take care, and stay safe.